So without further ado, we want to introduce our speakers. Today we've got Avi and Laura here. They are our definite MVPs, always speaking with us and the pros. So we're so happy to have you guys. We hope everyone enjoys the presentation. Go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Laura, you want to say hi quick?
Sorry, I was muted. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here with you today.
So Laura and I are really happy to be working with you today and conversing with you. Just as a reminder that the presentation that we're having will be available to you, as Susan mentioned, maybe a day or two after this is over. But it's going to be a PDF of the entire presentation. And Laura and I directly, intentionally made this very text heavy, so it's a reference for you. So we're not going to be reading all these slides. Basically, we're hoping to hit the high points with all of you today. And also, we really want to encourage you to not save all your questions towards the end when the recording will stop. But if you're comfortable and you wish, feel free to type any questions that you have while we're talking in the chat room. And Laura and I and Susan and Felicia will all be monitoring that. And a lot of times you ask questions that help us know much more about what you might need at that moment in time. Also, we typed in our emails at UNM, and we both welcome any kinds of questions or concerns or issues that you might have, or requests for more information or references. We really want to be available to you. So what we're going to talk about today is supporting at-risk youth, assessing and creating a safety plan for suicidal youth during a pandemic. And so we'll talk specifically about the issues of COVID and how this affects all of us as far as our ability to do safety planning, etc. Next slide. So our objectives today are, we're going to talk about an evidence-based instrument that the Department of Health supports as far as using statewide, so everybody talks the same language. That's the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. And I'll go through that with you at length. And then we're going to talk about an evidence-based instrument. It's actually, Laura and I combined a bunch of different templates for safety plan to give you a safety plan that's sort of an overview that you can use. Laura will talk with you about that at length. And part of safety planning is looking at reduction of lethal means, like we'll talk about in a lot of detail. We're not all that great about predicting suicide. We're not all that great about identifying people at risk in universal screens, although we're getting better at it. But what we can really do to minimize death and lethality is that if somebody is suicidal, that if they don't have loaded firearms available to them, or they're well supervised by people who are concerned about them, to prevent suffocation, hanging. Those are the two most common ways that people kill themselves when they attempt suicide. Then we can lower substantially the risk of death and dying. And at the end, I'll come back in and talk to you about how to use principles of motivational interviewing and solution-focused therapy to support reasons for living. Because what we understand for everyone is that whether it's a physical health problem or a mental health problem, just reducing signs and symptoms isn't a way to live a life. What we're really hopeful is that we restore a sense of meaning and value and purpose to someone. That's an essential part of recovery. So that's our end goal, is to enhance safety, build up and sustain resilience, and especially have people restore a sense of meaning and purpose and value in their life. Next slide. So neither Laura nor I have any kind of financial relationship to this program. Next. And this is a little bit, we won't belabor this, but this is a grant that Laura and I have been running together. It's called Alliance Building for Suicide Prevention and Resilience. And there's many aspects to that. We do a lot of community consultations on an emergency basis. We do a lot of trainings. This one is part of that way of doing things. We involve youth to get their input and their feedback about where to pursue things. And we also connect in a lot of ways to looking at community crisis response and recovery teams. We're working in the Albuquerque metro area. And again, as part of, if there are suicidal crises or contagions or clusters, Laura and I combine our efforts with a bunch of our colleagues throughout the state to try to help communities in need. Next slide. So a little bit of a background about suicide in New Mexico. And unfortunately, in the most recent statistics, New Mexico had the highest rate of suicide per capita. And we have a number of populations at risk. And you can see the information here. Actually, the greatest risk is for elderly men. And the second greatest risk is for middle-aged men. But as far as youth and young adults, the second leading cause of death behind accidents has been suicide for many years and is increasingly so. The other thing that I always like to bring up with this is that a lot of deaths that are ruled as accidents are, for all intents and purposes, suicide, people who wanted to kill themselves. But the Office of the Medical Investigator cannot legally determine that the cause of death is a suicide unless there's compelling evidence to do so. Not suspicion, but compelling. So this is all a way to say that suicide rates, as awful as they are actually underreported from what we understand. Next slide. So again, in youth, the rate increased 88% in 2018. And as you know, unfortunately, we have a lot of suicidal crises and a lot of suicidal clusters and contagion in this state. We most recently suffered from one that's very recent in Farmington. And I express my condolences. I saw a few people who were coming in from Farmington. That's a very beleaguered community at this point in time, and I hope that we can all find ways to support them. Next slide. So these are the most recent facts and figures. It says New Mexico 2020, but again, if you look at this, these are 2018 reports. That's the way these things go. We find out about them afterwards. So again, for youth, suicide is the leading cause of death. And what we look at is that on the average in 2018, one person died by suicide every 16 hours in the state. And again, that's what's been determined. So that suicide rate is probably significantly higher. Next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to focus on is the impact of the pandemic on all of us. And this is an article in July in the Albuquerque Journal, and I thought it exemplified the particular stressors of COVID. So what this is about is an 11-year-old boy from Hobbs who killed himself, who was doing extraordinarily well, was well-liked, had wonderful family, and responded terribly to the social isolation and the distance from peers and from all sorts of supports. School was so important to this young man. And so the social isolation before the pandemic is a major risk factor for self-injury and people who try to and succeed in killing themselves when they're suicidal. And it's only been intensified by COVID, which has all sorts of other impacts on us. One of them is the massive uncertainty about it, the economic uncertainty. A lot of people have no money for basic needs like food and shelter and clothing. There's uncertainty about who's going to be ill, who's going to transmit the illness. And there's recent evidence that children can suffer greatly. Some children have died who have been infected. And some children and adults also have what's called COVID for the long haul, meaning that they get out of the hospital, they're no longer significantly symptomatic of what they had when they were acutely ill, but they have cognitive issues, breathing issues, chronic pain syndromes that can last for months and months thereafter. So all those factors increase the likelihood of suicide at this point in time. From our end, our traditional way of having people screened and assessed is really hampered. Probably as much as a quarter, if not a third, of people in New Mexico, especially in certain communities, have no access to any technology. And home visiting is really problematic because of the concerns about transmission of illness, especially to healthcare providers, as well as to the population at large. So one of the things that we're very concerned about is not just with suicidality, but we found that the rate of reporting of child abuse has dropped by 80%. And the same thing for domestic violence, which means that a lot of people are, quote, sheltering with people who are unfortunately abusive to them. And our typical ways of finding out about, especially youth, by going to school when everything is virtual, it's very hard to track youth. And one of the things that's happening is a third to half, in some cases, are dropping out of school, are just unreachable. And so there's huge extra burdens because of the pandemic. Next slide. And a brief mention of all the risk factors with LGBTQ youth in New Mexico, as well as the other populations that are most at risk, like American Indian, Native Americans in New Mexico, as well as whites actually, are at greater risk. But what I always like to point out is that when any of these populations have access to mental health care, are not stigmatized, disenfranchised, are not suffering from structural poverty and neglect, there is nothing inherent about being Native American or LGBTQ, etc., that results in greater risk for substance abuse and mental health. It's really because of people who lack resources, who are stigmatized and disenfranchised and prejudiced against and not treated well by society and culture at large. Next slide. So this is really important for all of us who either work in primary care or emergency departments or connect to those folks. I myself am a pediatrician and a nurse as well as a child psychiatrist and have been connected to integrative healthcare for many decades. And what's important is that if we look at who sees people who end up killing themselves, it turns out that 50% of people who died by suicide had contact with healthcare providers in the month prior to suicide. 50%. 80% of people who died by suicide had contact with their healthcare provider in the year prior to their death. But look at the next one. Only 20% of people who died by suicide saw a behavioral health provider within a month before they died. So what this is saying is that screening in schools, in communities, in healthcare settings other than behavioral health care will find out who is at risk for suicide much more successfully than only looking at people who seek out behavioral health care. Next slide. So this is not a surprise to any of you, is that 90% of people who die by suicide have either serious mental illness or substance abuse disorders or both. More than 50% of suicides are associated with major depressive disorder. About 25% are associated with substance abuse disorder. Now, again, this is very tricky because, for instance, if you are misusing and susceptible to abuse of opioids, you can unintentionally or intentionally overdose. And a lot of times it's difficult to distinguish that. So sometimes people who intentionally overdose on opioids are dismissed as an unintentional overdose. This brings up something that I'd always like to emphasize, and Laura shares this concern with me. All of us too narrowly focus on the intent to kill ourselves, suicidality. We don't attend to who is at risk for dying because they're unsafe. So it's really important, I would encourage all of us not to just focus on, quote, assessment of suicidality, but assessment of risk for dying. And an example that I use an awful lot is if you have a toddler or a youngster who's in an abusive and chaotic and neglectful environment, and they are relatively impulsive, they can dart out into traffic and kill themselves. Or they can go to a dangerous area of their neighborhood with people who are threatening and not understand the risk that they're putting themselves in. Whereas you look at someone who has mild depressive disorder, who talks very vaguely and occasionally about vague ideas of wanting to die as opposed to plans and intent, who's really at risk for dying? The youngster, not the older one who is clear about their suicidality when they talk to other people. So please focus on lack of safety as opposed to the presence of suicidal intent, plans, behaviors, etc. Another example that I just gave is overdose by opioids. If I've heard, for instance, that heroin is laced with fentanyl or something else, which is far more lethal than the heroin, and I can't stop myself from getting the next injection, then I put myself at great risk for dying. I might not have any conscious wish to die or to end my life, but I'm at risk for dying more than someone who vocalizes their concerns, who's made no plans or attempts. Next slide. So thoughts of suicide are very common, especially in teenagers. Next slide. And this leads to myths that Laura and I always like to talk about first, because if you believe in any of these myths, whether you're a parent or a teacher or a provider or a caring adult, it'll prevent people from getting screened, prevent getting people from getting assessed, prevent people from getting the help that they need. So I'll briefly touch on these. They're all totally untrue. If someone is really suicidal, they're probably going to kill themselves at some point, no matter what you do. So in other words, we're totally ineffective. All the history and the evidence of millions of people is that the people who survive a near lethal attempt uniformly, with rare exceptions, less than 1% or so, say, thank God I survived this, I'll never do it again. And they don't. They don't make an attempt that's potentially fatal after that. Asking a depressed person puts the idea in their heads. It's the opposite, that when you create a space, a safe space for people to talk about self-injury and suicidality, they're relieved. They talk more about all the risk factors that they have, their warning signals, and they also talk about wanting to be protected from those thoughts and not end their life. There's no point in asking about suicidal thoughts. If they're going to do it, they won't tell you. That's a very, very small group of people who actually fall into that category. What that is middle-aged and elderly people who've been suffering from severe depression, debilitating depression, that's totally resistant to treatment. They've tried everything under the sun and it doesn't help. And they're reluctant to tell people that they're suicidal and desperate to end their suffering because they don't want to have their life sustained because it's insufferable. This is akin to people who have a horrible prognosis from terminal cancer, and societally, culturally, we're getting more understanding of euthanasia and the wish to end unbearable suffering. But the vast majority, again, are very ambivalent about their desire to die and very much want to speak to the side of them, the parts of them that want to live, that have reasons to live, and reasons to still connect to the people that they care about. Someone making suicidal threats won't do it. They're looking for attention. Please get that out of your heads. I hear so much from all adults about, oh, they're just doing it for attention. We all do everything for attention. I'm wanting your attention. You're wanting mine while we're conversing. Attending is caring. And we'd much rather have people over-report self-injury and suicidality than under-report. It's a form of communication. So please don't dismiss, discount, or stifle people who are talking about suicidality. Listen to them. They're in pain of some nature. We want to help them. If you stop someone from killing themselves one way, they'll probably find another. We already talked about that. Next slide. I don't need to belabor this. I think you all know what a suicide attempt is. Now we're going to launch into that Columbia screen and the 6 questions to talk about this. Next slide. So the suicidal inquiry, what we're trying to do is look about thoughts, plans, behavior. So we're looking at ideas and wishes, a plan. So you say, when am I going to do it? How am I going to do it? How am I going to prepare myself for doing it? Behaviors, past attempts, aborted and interrupted attempts. This is an important distinction. And one of the things, by the way, that I would like you to attend to while I'm talking is that we really appreciate all this information. Too often when we do assessments, we hear denied suicidality or positive for suicidal ideation. That tells us so little. It's also like when people go to an emergency room and they say, don't need inpatient hospital, go back. We don't know what that means. So I'd like you to look at all the granular detail that's so critical in really understanding the unique circumstances of each individual. So aborted versus interrupted means if I'm taking pills and I decide in the middle of that I need to stop, I don't want to die, I've stopped the attempt on my own. Interrupted is I'm taking it in the bathroom and my significant other hears something that's going amiss, knocks on the door, finds me and pushes the pills out of my face. Now, one of the things to think about, though, is a lot of times an interrupted attempt is actually an aborted attempt. An example that happened to me a few months ago was I was visiting a school and giving a talk to all the school counselors, and they were called by security, who found out that one of the students had been in the process of making an attempt that was potentially fatal in a classroom that was empty during that period. That student quickly admitted that they didn't do it in a remote area. They did it when they knew that all sorts of people would be there to discover them and stop the attempt, which is what happened. They got hospitalized and got really excellent treatment. So the point of this is that, again, we want to find out the circumstances. That student really had what we would call an aborted attempt. They arranged for the circumstances so that they would be discovered and someone would stop them. They might not have had the wherewithal to stop it themselves, but they arranged for those circumstances. That tells us a lot about their intent. For those of you who are used to stages of change, by the way, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance, what we're talking about with self-injury and suicidality is, are they barely contemplating, pre-contemplation? So very vague ideas of life sucks and I can't go on. Are they beginning to contemplate that I'm really suffering? I'm in a lot of misery and pain. Should I move on to really planning this? Are they at the point of preparation, looking at the timing, the planning, the rehearsals, etc.? And then are they wanting to move into action? So if you think of that frame, that's another. I read recently that a person at risk of suicide, this is from Deshawn, will appear happy as they get closer. How do we as practitioners examine and assess the difference? So that, Deshawn, is that, remember that very limited case that I told you about of people who are chronically, significantly, persistently depressed? They seem to be a little bit brighter when they've reached the decision that they're going to end their life and put themselves out of misery. Again, it's very similar to people who have any kind of terminal illness. I've been working with terminally ill children for over 4 decades now. And so one of the things you find is kids who are in tremendous pain and tremendous suffering, when they understand that the end is near, or their parents or guardians give them more opioids than they might need for pain management in hopes that that will precipitate the end of their suffering, they are more engaged, they are more relieved. And so that's what that relates to, that the end is in sight, the end of suffering. Next. So now we're going to go through the questions. This is the form, and now the next slide is going to go through the details. So the first part of this is this wish to be dead. And I'm always asked about, how do you think about this with young children? So of course, you want to understand that the youngest children, up until about age 5 or 6, don't understand what death is. They think of death as sort of like falling asleep. And that's why culturally, I always like to point out, that's why we have vampires and the walking dead and the living dead and zombies, is because it's sort of our way of culture saying, are you dead or are you alive? What happens, right? So they don't see that death is something that's irreversible. They think it's reversible. They think oftentimes that a part of you is broken that can be fixed. Like they see a bird that's dead and they say, well, only if you fix their wing, then they can fly away, right? So one way of asking this for the very young and for other people who don't concretely think about wanting to end their life is it really hard to face the day? Do you wish that you didn't have to wake up because then you wouldn't have to deal with anything. That's the beginnings of suicidality. Have you thought about being dead or what it would be like to be dead, or wished you could go to sleep and never wake up? Next, after that is, have you had thoughts about doing something to make yourself not alive anymore? So you see, you're beginning to move from the vaguest of contemplation, from pre-contemplation, now into contemplation. Next. So the act of suicidal ideation is without any kind of intent to act. So again, you're still in the contemplation place. Have you thought about how you would do it or what you would do to make yourself not alive anymore? What kinds of things did you think about? Next slide. The next piece is when you thought about making yourself not alive anymore, was this something that you might actually do? So in other words, when you're having this contemplation about it, are you actually preparing in some kind of way to act? And the next part is even fuller preparation. Have you decided how or when you would make yourself? How would you do it? What would you do? Have you worked out the details of this kind of plan? And this is a really important part. I'm guessing that a lot of you sort of can't live in New Mexico and not have some understanding of motivational interviewing. It's one of our great gifts through Bill Miller and his team at UNM to the rest of the world. Motivational interviewing is an enormously influential way of thinking about people. And the key concept to there is ambivalence. There's parts of you that feel one way, there's parts of you that feel another. So that language is really helpful about, was a part of you thinking about this, moving forward in this kind of way to wanting to kill yourself? And was there other parts of you that felt, no, I don't want to do that? How ambivalent are you and how does that balance out? Reasons for dying, reasons for living. Next slide. So putting that all together is all the 6 questions that we just talked about. Next slide. And then, as I mentioned in that example of the toddler in a chaotic environment versus the mildly but chronically depressed young woman, some risky behaviors have no conscious wish to die, but they may result in death. So that young one and the person who unintentionally overdosed and died from heroin that they might not even have known was a stronger dose or laced with another drug that was stronger that they weren't aware of. They had no conscious wish to die, but they were unsafe. They were in a dangerous situation. And some people, this is really important too, with risky behaviors with a conscious wish to die, that may not result in their death. So a classic example that I've unfortunately run into is people, let's take the example of Tylenol. A lot of people know that Tylenol is damaging to your liver and you can kill yourself that way. So some people will think, well, if the normal dose for me is 1 or 2 extra strength a day, if I take 10, I'll kill myself. Now, that could give you some liver damage, especially if you have some pre-existing, but you won't die from that. So then what happens in the emergency room is they say, well, the bottle had 100 pills or 200 pills. They, quote, only took 10, so they're at very low risk. But if that person believed that 10 was lethal, they were taking a lethal attempt. The flip side of that is they have pain, they have fever, and they say, well, the 1 or 2 isn't really working for me, so I'm going to take as much as I can to alleviate that, like mom's sleeping pills or dad's pain pills. They don't know that what they're doing is in any way lethal, but they're at risk for dying. So again, just saying that somebody denies suicidal ideas and plans and attempts does not help us determine whether or not somebody might die. Next slide. So now I'm going to switch to my wonderful colleague, Laura, and she's going to talk about safety planning. This is the first step, identifying warning signals. Take it away, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you, Avi. So we're going to switch over to looking at some risk factors and key symptoms, and more specifically, talking about safety planning and also reducing access to lethal means, which is really important. So as Avi mentioned early on in the webinar, we have a tremendous amount of information in these slides. So I won't go through each slide item by item. But I do want to just let you know that we have a lot of information in here as well as references at the end. So these are just some risk factors and key symptoms to notice and pay attention to. One of them, of course, is psychological pain, extreme hurt, anguish, or misery, stress levels that are increasing, noticing if somebody is feeling more agitated, hopelessness. We're always wanting to listen for hopelessness. And self-hate is really important to pay attention to when you're beginning to hear someone talk about disliking themselves, loss of self-respect, or no self-esteem. So these risk factors are important to pay attention to because this helps us to understand when we need to implement a safety plan. Next slide, please. So again, with these risk factors that we've talked about before, I think that Avi did a nice job in talking about these various risk factors and what we need to pay attention to. But just to note that these individuals, LGBTQ youth who may be experiencing prejudice or discrimination, remember that's different than what Avi said. There's nothing inherently wrong if somebody's supported in their community. But if they are facing prejudice, discrimination, rejection by family, we want to pay attention to that. Historical trauma plays a large part for American Indians and Alaska Natives that can contribute to rates of suicide. And then Avi already mentioned the high rates for men, particularly men in middle age or at risk. So again, we're putting all this information together so that when you're encountering these things, these risk factors, that some of the warning bells are going off in your head, those of you who are working with youth, just to pay attention to. Okay, next slide, please. And then more risk factors, again, that I'm not going to go into in great detail, but just to pay attention and read through these in your own time. If substance abuse is going up, more isolation, burdens to others, people tend to underreport their hopelessness, and if you know of current stressors going up, a family history, these are all things that we want to pay attention to in terms of risk factors for suicidality. Next slide. And then the thing to remember is that there are protective factors for suicide. There are internal protective factors as well as external protective factors. So the internal protective factors that we want to build upon, that we'll talk about later, will be these included things in terms of a hope. There's some hope or attachment to others, confidence, having some frustration tolerance, fear of suicide. These things can all be internal protective factors. And then the next slide talks about more external protective factors. So these protective factors are things that can help cushion and help protect somebody from the risk of suicide. And these are responsibilities to others. People who say, who would take care of my pet if I were to die? Those are protective factors. Social connectedness. Again, right now with the COVID and the isolation that people are feeling, this risk factor is something we really need to pay attention to. Avi highlighted that earlier with that very tragic story that was written about in the journal about the 11-year-old. So we know that that's a heightened concern. So we want to think about how can we help youth link to other people so that we can build upon this protective factor of connectedness. Next slide. And I won't go into a lot of information, but this is a really useful scale, this Reasons for Living. You can Google this and find this online. this is really useful to go through with individuals to talk about when they have problems, who can they turn to for support or advice, feeling loved. And so this is a nice inventory that you can go through with adolescents and youth around what are my reasons for living. And that's important after we go through a suicide screen, like the Columbia Suicide Rating Scale that Avi just went over, is to then talk to youth. What are your reasons for living? Because oftentimes when people are feeling so hopeless and despondent, they're not thinking about, why would I want to live? So this is a very useful tool we wanted to highlight to you. Next slide, please. And then supervision and care is incredibly important. So we want to look at, how do we supervise and care for people? So again, we can't limit what somebody has access to. We can limit in some ways, and we'll talk about access to lethal means in a little bit, but we can send youth home, talking with parents about supervising individuals. So if they have access to things, or if we feel that they're at risk, we want to make sure that we are asking parents or guardians, whoever can monitor and supervise youth. Avi talks a lot about determining in psychiatric emergency room, how do we determine if it's safe to send someone home or not? Well, if they have a family that's very safe and supportive and will be monitoring a youth, that helps to make the decision about whether or not we can send a youth home who may be at higher risk versus somebody who comes from an extremely chaotic, unsafe home that's not going to be monitored. And if they're at high risk for suicide, they may ultimately be hospitalized until they're stable. Next slide, please. And again, we'll talk more. I'm not going to go into great detail because I want to get to the safety planning, but we want to always assess levels of risk. Next slide, please. And Susan, this is the part where I told you we'd probably go through some of these slides. So I just want to refer this. This is a really helpful grid to look at in terms of protective factors, suicide risk, and possible interventions. And you can see it's rated high, moderate, or low. So this is a nice table to refer to when you're doing an assessment to look at someone's risk level. Next slide. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of safety planning. I'm not going to get into great detail, but I want you to be familiar with this template and safety planning. Many of you have access, I'm sure, to safety plans, use them in your agencies or schools. And so we talk about it. There's a safety plan that, again, we like to give you free resources. This is from Stanley Brown. You can Google it and find safety planning. But let's take a look at it. But we're going to look at warning signs, coping skills, and then at the end, professional resources that someone can reach out to. So let's go to the next slide, Susan. So when do we use a safety plan? So I would say that we want to overuse safety plans. I think anytime we have a concern about a youth who's experiencing any kind of risk, we want to be able to implement safety plans and have these available handily in your agencies. We can go through these events that lead up to a crisis, how someone might cope through it, and different steps they would take. So a safety plan is a collaborative process. It's not something that I would do as a counselor with my client. I would have a conversation with them in a collaborative manner about what are the things that might be a warning sign, what are these different steps that you could take, and then ultimately, how are you going to use this? And at the end, I think we'll have some time to show you. If we don't, at the end of the slides, there are a number of apps that are free downloadable that you can use or have your clients download. I see a question from Melissa. You mentioned we should think about how we can link youth to others so they're not isolated. Do you have ideas of resources during the pandemic when we're in remote learning? That's a really good question. I think we could probably do a whole webinar on that. Melissa, what I would recommend is actually, if you want to email me, I've put my email in the chat. I would be happy to talk with you about linking. But I think in general, it's having conversations with youth that you're seeing about Who would they like to reach out to? Who would they like to connect to? And how could we make that happen? We need to help bridge a gap right now. There's a huge chasm of youth, and sometimes youth are, youth sometimes, I've raised 2 boys, so I know in adolescence it's challenging sometimes for them to socially reach out, even when they're in the midst of people. So I think we need to do a lot of assistance and help with individuals. And somebody's putting in New Mexico Crisis Access Line, and that's absolutely a great place for people. There's a text line if they're in crisis, but I think just in general around connection and communication is linking to things that might be available in your schools or in your communities that youth can connect to.
So
And
Laura,
feel
I'm just
free to
going to
put
make
on the right.
a quick comment too, because a lot of people don't have any technology.
Right.
So one of the things that the state has put a lot of effort to is looking at community gatekeepers, both high school students and middle school students, as well as adults in the community who are caring. And a lot of times people will have social networks and they'll feel comfortable doing some kind of home visit or connection for people who don't have cell phones and wireless, et cetera. But I've also known in some communities where athletic coaches or band leaders in the
Or
school
teachers.
or other
Yeah.
social supports will reach out.
Right. Yeah, thank you. So I think ask the question in your community and in your schools of who might be able to reach out to youth, because I think youth sometimes have a trouble reaching out on their own. Okay, we just have a few minutes, but Susan, if we could go to the next slide. And let's skip this slide. I think we've already covered warning signs. And then of course, paying attention to changes in mood is important. And the next slide. Alamogordo has a mobile crisis unit. That's really great. And looking at spiritual support. So sometimes faith-based communities and churches are willing to reach out as well. So this is the Stanley Brown Safety Plan template. And the main pieces I want to touch base with you are the first 2 or 3, which are, let's go to the next slide, Susan. Okay, we're going to skip. So the first part of a safety plan is helping to identify risky behaviors or things that might become problematic or create a crisis in someone. So that's the collaborative conversation. And then let's talk about the next slide, which is how do we then have a conversation with individuals. These are more warning signs. We'll skip through this one too, Susan, because I want to get to the piece around on my own coping. And so these are things that we want to, after someone's identified these areas that are problematic or could become crisis for them, having conversations with them about what can they do on their own for coping. Any kind of an activity that's not harmful or hurtful. This helps people develop their own self-control and efficacy around managing these types of things that might be problematic for them. And then let's go to the next slide. So again, these can be things like distractions. So youth really like music, doing different things, playing video games. Any kind of distraction can be helpful because it gets them out of that place of maybe where they're ruminating or having thoughts about harming themselves. Things that are self-soothing, taking a bath, reading, burning a candle, any kind of exercise, shooting hoops. There are different relaxation apps that we can introduce as well. Next slide. And then again, the next step is that the progressive of a safety plan is that if the first 2 don't work, we go to step 3. If that doesn't work, we go to step 4. We want to help really support youth with these coping strategies. So the next step is coping for support and distraction. And these can be socialization. So this isn't a conversation with somebody about I'm having suicidal thoughts, but this is just having a conversation for distraction, going to healthy social settings. So even though right now that's very limited, I've seen kids out skateboarding and doing things that are social distancing that are really helpful for them. And you can role play these kinds of things also in terms of helping to, who would they talk to for support and distraction. Thank you, Avi's putting in more information because we're getting to the end and we're having to go through this very quickly. Okay, next one. This is really important. This is from a poll, the Harris poll, that Americans believe that suicide can be prevented. 94% of Americans believe that suicide can be prevented and would take action to help someone close to them who is thinking about suicide. So we want to always keep that in mind, and that we can really help implement these kinds of safety plans so that we can help keep people safe. Avi, I'm just checking in with you with time. We've only got a couple of minutes left.
I think, why don't you finish about the safety planning and add the piece about why we do lethal means counseling at the end of the safety plan as opposed to.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please, Susan. And then the next step again is this is where we tell someone. So if the on my own coping skills are not working and someone is still having a lot of thoughts about self-harm, then we want to encourage them to tell someone. And this is the person they call, doesn't necessarily need to be a professional person at this point. Again, we're building self-efficacy with individuals so that they can learn how to reach out for help. So this could be a family member, a close friend, excuse me, we can even share safety plans with individuals. And so this is really helpful. I've had situations where I will create a safety plan with a client, and then we will together agree to share it with somebody. And we might invite that person into the session and have the conversation together. Okay, let's go to the next one. And then if these don't work, then lastly, we want to get to a list of contacting professionals and agencies and who to ask for help. And this is where in the safety plan, we list all of these numbers we have for reaching out, New Mexico Access Crisis Line, Agora, the National Suicide Prevention, all of those things. So, and then the last step that we want to go to is, if you go to the next slide, Susan, is reducing access to lethal means. We ask about this at the end of doing an assessment, because at this point, people are generally feeling as though we are now, they have an ally, they have somebody that they can talk with, hopefully having an open conversation. We don't want to ask them about at the very beginning, well, do you have access to guns, or how would you kill yourself? I think that can be very putting off for people. So what we do is we do that at the end. And it is important that we need to ask, and we can't make assumptions that people don't have access to firearms. It's very critical that we ask these questions. So let's go to the next slide, Susan. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we always document these things. For those of you who are therapists, put the safety plan in the client's chart, but we want to make sure other people have access to it. For people who have, and I'm just going to speak about reducing access to lethal means, because we know that around, I think it's in New Mexico, 51% of individuals who die by suicide have done that with a firearm. And so it's important to have conversations with youth and with their families about, is there access to a firearm? And we can't assume that because a parent says the gun cabinet is locked that they don't have a key, because kids oftentimes know how to access those things. So we also know that when someone uses a firearm, that the likelihood of them dying is extremely high. I've forgotten the percentage, Avi. I think it's 90-something% or 86%, but it's very, very high.
Yep.
So it's important to restrict access to lethal means for individuals. We again talked about supervision. We can't possibly hide all of the knives and belts and ropes in the house, but sometimes we need to supervise people, but we have to restrict access to lethal means. We want to make sure that, I'm just looking, if we could go down a couple of more slides, Susan. Let's go down a little more. So this, oh, could you go back one? I'll just talk about this, Avi, and then I think I'll end. Could you go back? There it is. So suicide crisis is very brief. We know there's a study on the next slide that talks about oftentimes within a 5-minute or short window of time is when someone will actually make the decision about ending their life and taking action. If people in that very short period of time do not have access to lethal means, they are much more likely, less likely to die. So we want to make sure that we keep access to lethal means restricted. There's free online counseling. In the end of the slides, there are references. You can go online and see the training for that. So I think for the sake of time, I'm going to end here. And thank you for your comments, everyone. Avi, do you want to say a few words to wrap up?
Just as a reminder, we're going to turn it over to Susan so you'll all know how to get your continuing education and how to get the PDF of all the slides that we're talking about, including all the references. And then the recording will stop. And for those of you who'd like, we'd love to talk with you further for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, everyone.